You've often heard the phrase, take it with a pinch of salt. So, is salt good or bad, or is this just a witch's tale? Now, we have been warned about the dangers of taking salt for as long as I can remember or you can remember. Now, a high salt intake has been claimed to cause a number of health problems, including high blood pressure and heart disease. I think these are the two main ones that you always hear about. However, there is no conclusive evidence to support this. On the contrary, many studies actually show that eating too little salt can be harmful. So let us delve further into the topic and find out, is salt good or bad for you, or should you take more salt? So, what is salt by definition? Salt is also called sodium chloride, and it consists of 40% sodium and 60% chloride by weight, and is by far the biggest dietary source of sodium, which is salt. And the words salt and sodium are so often used interchangeably, so much so that we take it as one and the same. Some products of salt may contain trace amounts of calcium, potassium, iron, and zinc, and iodine is often added to table salt. Now, the essential minerals in salt act as an important electrolytes in the body. They help with fluid balance, nerve transmission, and muscle function. So, see how important salt is to your body. So, some amount of salt is naturally found in most foods. It's also frequently added to foods in order to improve the flavor or to make it savory. In the good old days, salt was used to preserve food. High amounts can prevent growth of the bacteria that cause food to go bad. So, in the good old days, people used salt too, but of course in different ways. Now, salt is harvested in two main forms, from salt mines and by evaporating salty water or other mineral rich water. There are actually many types of salt available. Common varieties include the plain table salt, the Himalayan pink salt, which is very well known, and sea salt. The different types of salt may vary in terms of taste, texture, and color. You can have it coarsely ground or finely ground. In case you're wondering which type is the healthiest, the truth is they really are quite similar and not much of a difference between them. So, what you could, the summary is salt is mainly composed of two minerals, sodium and chloride, which have various functions in the body. It is found naturally in most foods and is widely used to improve flavor. So, how does salt really affect heart health, or does it really have an impact? Now, the authorities have been telling us to cut back on sodium for decades, or what seems like decades. They say that you should consume no more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day or less if you can. Now, this is about 1 teaspoon or 6 grams of salt. So, this is about 40% sodium, so you need to multiply by 2.5 factor. However, about 90% of the adults consume a lot more than the necessary amount. Eating too much salt is claimed to raise blood pressure, thereby increasing the risk of heart disease and stroke. However, there are some serious doubts about the true benefits of sodium restriction. It is true that reducing the salt intake can lower blood pressure, especially in people with a medical condition called salt-sensitive hypertension. But for healthy individuals, the reduction is really very minute and not of much significance. So one study found that for individuals with a normal blood pressure, restricting salt intake reduced the systolic blood pressure by only 2.42 mm Hg and diastolic blood pressure by only 1.00 mm Hg. So this is not exactly very impressive results you would hope to get from enduring a tasteless diet. What is more, some reviews have found no evidence that limiting salt intake will reduce the risk of heart attacks, strokes, or death. So what's the summary? Limiting salt intake does result in a slight reduction in blood pressure. However, there is no strong evidence linking reduced intake to a lower risk of heart attacks, strokes, or death. Low salt intake, on the other hand, can be harmful. So you have now the high salt and the low salt. While the high salt has not been proven to be bad for your health unless you take so much of it, but low salt on the other hand seems to be harmful. So some evidence suggesting that low salt diet can be downright harmful. Some of the benefits or the effects are increased LDL cholesterol and triglycerides. Salt restriction has been linked to elevated LDL, which is normally known as the bad cholesterol, and triglycerides. Now, heart disease. Several reports show that less than 3,000 milligrams of sodium per day is linked to an increased risk of dying from heart disease. Now, what about heart failure? One analysis found that restricting salt intake increased the risk of dying for people with heart failure. The effect was staggering, with about 160% higher risk of death in individuals who reduced their salt intake. Insulin resistance. Now, they report that a low salt diet may increase insulin resistance. What about type 2 diabetes, which is linked to insulin resistance? One study found that in type 2 diabetes patients, less sodium was associated with an increased risk of death. So, in summary, a low salt diet has been linked to higher LDL and triglyceride levels and increased insulin resistance. It may increase the risk of death from heart disease, heart failure, and type 2 diabetes. Now, high salt intake is linked to stomach cancer. Stomach cancer, also known as gastric cancer, is the fifth most common cancer in the world. It is the third leading cause of cancer death worldwide and is responsible for more than 700,000 deaths every year. It is found that people with high salt intake have a 68% higher risk of stomach cancer compared to those who have a lower intake. Not a low intake, but a lower intake. So how this happens, not really well understood, but some theories are growth of bacteria. A high salt intake may increase the growth of the Helicobacter pylori, a bacteria that can lead to inflammation and gastric ulcers. This may increase the risk of stomach cancer. Damage to the stomach lining. A diet high in salt may damage and inflame the stomach lining, thus exposing it to carcinogen. However, these are just studies, and they can't prove that high salt intake causes stomach cancer, only that they are strongly associated or have a linkage. So a summary is that there are studies that have linked high salt intake with an increased risk of stomach cancer. This may be caused by several factors. Now, which foods, you may wonder then, are high in salt or sodium? Most of the salt that comes in a modern diet comes from restaurant foods or packaged processed foods. That's good to know. In fact, it's estimated that about 75% of the salt diet comes from processed food. Only 25% of the intake occur naturally in food or is added during cooking or at the table. That is a sigh of relief. Now, salted snack foods, canned and instant soups, processed meats, pickled foods, and soy sauce are examples of high salt foods. They do have a lot of unsalty foods that actually contain surprisingly high amounts of salt, including bread, cottage cheese, and some breakfast cereals. So if you are trying to cut back, then the food labels almost always list the sodium content. In summary, foods that are high in salt include processed foods such as salted snacks, which you love, and instant soups in cans, yes, or those in the paper bag where you can open it up and then pour it and add boiling water or put it in the hot pot. Less obvious foods such as bread and cottage cheese may also contain a lot. So, should you really eat less salt? Some health conditions make it necessary to cut back on salt. If your doctor wants you to limit your intake, then please do so. However, if you are a healthy person who eats mostly whole single ingredient foods, then there's probably no need for you to worry about salt intake. In this case, you can feel free to add salt during cooking or at the table in order to improve flavor. Now, eating extremely high amounts of salt can be harmful, but eating too little may be just as bad for your health. So, it is always said that you need to balance it and not to take too much or too little. So the optimal intake is somewhere between the two extremes. Thank you.